Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're not just going to look at the Philippine Constitution as some dry, dusty legal document. Instead, we're going to treat it as the architectural blueprint of an entire state. When we look at a nation, we usually just see the politics, the daily news, the events. But underneath all of that is a structural framework. It's a master plan that dictates exactly how the government is built, how it operates, and how it interacts with the rest of the world. And once you look at it through this architectural lens, the dense world of political and international law suddenly becomes incredibly clear.
So here is our construction plan for today. We'll start with step 1, the foundation, which is the Constitution. Then step 2, the property line of sovereignty. Step 3, the defensive fence of state immunity. Step 4, our load-bearing walls. And finally, step 5, the engine room. Let's dive right in.
Starting off with Section 1, Foundation, the Constitution and Amendments.
Because the 1987 Philippine Constitution is the absolute bedrock of the nation, altering it is not something you can just do on a whim. If you want to remodel this foundation, you're looking at either an amendment, which is a simple change to a specific part, or a revision, a complete overhaul. And Article 17 outlines 3 really rigorous pathways to get this done. Proposals can come from Congress, but that requires a massive 3/4 vote of all its members. Or a constitutional convention can be called. Finally, the power can be given directly to the people through an initiative. Now, for that last one, you need a huge petition from at least 12% of all registered voters, and that has to include at least 3% from every single legislative district. It's a huge hurdle, right? But that ensures any changes reflect the genuine sovereign will of the people, not just a passing trend. And it's worth noting that on the global stage, while international tribunals completely respect these internal changes, a state can't just rewrite its constitution to suddenly dodge binding international treaties.
Moving on to Section 2, Property Line, Sovereignty, and Global Rules.
So, Article 2 tells us the Philippines is a democratic and republican state, where sovereignty resides in the people. But how does this internal sovereignty interact with our international neighbors? Well, Article 2, Section 2 gives us the answer. It explicitly renounces war as a national policy and states that the Philippines adopts the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land. We call this the doctrine of incorporation. As we saw in the Paul Almanzara's case, customary international rules, the ones formed by widespread practice in the belief that the practice is legally required, known legally as opinio juris, they automatically cross our borders. This soft law instantly gains the force of domestic law simply through this constitutional declaration.
But wait, there is a really vital distinction here, brilliantly laid out in the Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association case. While soft law and customary rules use incorporation to automatically become domestic law, binding treaties, the hard law, require a process called transformation. For a treaty to actually be valid and effective domestically, it must undergo strict transformation via the concurrence of at least 2/3 of all members of the Senate. Basically, you cannot bypass the legislative gatekeepers when you are making hard, binding agreements with other nations.
All right, Section 3, Defensive Fence, the Immune State.
Think of this fence as protecting the structural integrity of the state so it doesn't collapse under relentless legal attacks. The golden rule here is captured in Article 16, Section 3. The state may not be sued without its consent. Now, why is that? It's grounded in 2 theories. First, the positivist theory, which basically argues there's no legal right against the authority that actually makes the laws. But practically speaking, there is the sociological theory. As the court noted in the Republic versus Villasor case, if the state could just be sued by anyone at any time, public service would grind to an absolute halt. The government's time and resources would be completely eaten up by litigation.
And this brings us to the restrictive theory of sovereign immunity, which the Philippines adheres to. The state is absolutely immune when it comes to sovereign or public acts, what the law calls jure imperi. However, if the state steps outside that sovereign role and engages in private or business acts, jure justonis, it drops that shield. It can be held liable just like a private corporation. This internal defense directly mirrors an international law maxim, part in parum non habet imperium. In plain English, an equal does not have power over an equal. One sovereign state cannot be dragged into the domestic courts of another against its will.
Now for Section 4, Load-Bearing Walls, Power, Checks, and Balances.
To balance the massive weight of government, power is divided among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. As the Landmark Angara case established, each department is supreme within its own sphere, but they are bound by an elaborate system of checks and balances to prevent absolute independence. A key rule keeping these load-bearing walls stable is delegata potest non potest delegari, meaning what has been delegated cannot be further delegated. The power to make laws is given to Congress, and they generally can't just pass off their lawmaking duties to administrative bodies. But modern governance is complex, so some delegation is necessary. To do this validly, Congress has to provide strict architectural guidelines. The law must pass the completeness test, leaving nothing for the delegate to do but enforce it, and the sufficient standard test, which maps out the exact boundaries of the delegate's authority.
To really understand what happens when these walls shift, think of the Belgica v. Ochoa case as a massive structural stress test. The Supreme Court actually struck down the infamous pork barrel system precisely because it allowed legislative encroachment upon the executive's prerogative of implementing the law. Basically, one wall, the legislature, was carrying weight meant for the executive. That threatened a structural collapse by violating the separation of powers.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the engine room, fundamental state powers.
Let's step down into the engine room to look at the inherent sovereign powers that are inseparable from the state. Honestly, these powers don't even require express constitutional grants to exist. Instead, the Constitution serves to limit them, mostly through the Bill of Rights, to ensure they don't crush the citizens. So here is your power grid. First up, police power. This is the most essential and least limitable power, used to promote the general welfare. It is the reason your business is regulated for safety. To be valid, it just has to pass the means, purpose, and reasonability tests. Second is eminent domain, the ultimate right to appropriate private property for public use. The strict limitation here is that it must come with just compensation. A perfect modern example of this is Republic Act No. 10752, the Right-of-Way Act. It facilitates taking private land for crucial national infrastructure, like highways, while ensuring owners are promptly and fairly paid. And third, taxation. This is governed by the lifeblood theory. Like the court said in the NPC v. Cabinet Kuan case, without taxes, the government can neither exist nor endure. It is the literal lifeblood of the nation, though it must be uniform and equitable.
But remember our property lines from earlier. Even these mighty internal engines don't operate in a vacuum. Applying these fundamental powers constantly intersects with international law. For instance, when the state uses its police power for environmental regulations, it has to make sure it aligns with international environmental treaties. Or, if the state exercises eminent domain against foreign entities, it has to respect bilateral investment treaties and global human rights obligations. The just compensation paid must align with global standards to avoid international claims of unlawful expropriation.
And that brings us to the end of this explainer, but I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We've seen how meticulously the Constitution designs the state's internal architecture and exactly how carefully it manages its international borders, but as the world becomes more interconnected, the line between domestic law and international obligation gets really blurred. So, when the immense internal engines of the state clash directly with the unyielding force of global treaties, who truly has the final say over the nation's blueprint? Keep that question in mind as you watch national policies unfold on the global stage. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of the state.